Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Or if you're new here, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be discussing this really wonderful book which I recently read by Amy Sohn, The Man Who Hated Women, Sex, Censorship, and Civil Liberties in the Gilded Age. And it's about Anthony Comstock, this like horrible, this disgusting person, like, one of my least favorite people in history, and how he was persecuting a number of women during his reign of terror working for the U.S. Post Office. He was basically kind of like the male version of the movie Hays Code, if you know what that is, which was from 1934 until about 1968. It was basically just like, oh, anything that's not like 100% G-rated and like, puppies and flowers and rainbow and glitters and kittens and stuff. Oh, that's just like obscene and like people can't do that. And it's just like it really gets into like the society and history, like, the social and cultural changes which were happening in the mid to late 19th century and the early 20th century. And like a lot of these women he was persecuting, they were like active in the suffragist movement and also like free love. She uses the term sex radicals to refer to them, and sexologists and just like things like that. Oh, basically all like smut stuff. And so anyway, like enough rambling. Here's the synopsis. Anthony Comstock, special agent to the U.S. Post Office, was one of the most important men in the lives of 19th century women. His eponymous law, passed in 1873, penalized the mailing of contraceptives and obscene materials with steep fines and long sentences. The word Comstockery came to connote repression and prudery. Between 1873 and Comstock's death in 1915, 8 remarkable women were charged with violating state and federal Comstock laws. These sex radicals supported contraception, sexual education, gender equality. The term should actually be sex equality, because the word gender was not used in that way in that era, but anyway, I know that's something for another video. And women's right to pleasure. They took on the fearsome censor in explicit personal writing, seeking to redefine work, family, marriage, and love for a bold new era. In The Man Who Hated Women, Amy Sohn tells the overlooked story of their valiant attempts to fight Comstock in court and in the press. They were publishers, writers, and doctors, and they included the first woman presidential candidate, Victoria C. Woodhull, the virgin sexologist Ida C. Craddock, and the anarchist Emma Goldman. In their willingness to oppose a monomaniac who viewed reproductive rights as a threat to the American family, the sex radicals paved the way for second-wave feminism, of which I am a part. I'm a second-wave radical feminist for the most part. Risking imprisonment and death, they redefined birth control access as a civil liberty. The Man Who Hated Women brings these women's stories to vivid life, recounting their personal and romantic travails alongside their political battles. Without them, there would be no pill, no Planned Parenthood, no Roe v. Wade. This is a forgotten history of the women who waged war for the right to control their bodies. And I'm just going to basically go through a little bit about Mr. Comstock and the women, and a few one of men also involved with them whom he was persecuting. Not like blow-by-blow synopsis, obviously just like basically a little bit about the cases. And if you're not already aware, based on the title and the subject of the book, there are going to be some like PG-13 bits of content in this video. I'm not trying not to be like too like graphic or anything, but some of it just basically can't be avoided. And so anyway, the story begins at the Chicago World's Fair, also officially the Columbian Exposition, in the summer of 1893, and at the Cairo Street Theater. And this was something called the Danse de Ventre. It was basically like belly dancing, and Ida C. Craddock, the above mentioned virgin sexologist, was doing it with a bunch of female dancers from Egypt and Algeria. And like Comstock was one of the people who saw it, and he heard people talk about it. He was absolutely horrified because he felt it was like basically mimicking the motions of sexual intercourse. Particularly, there was like a bottle on their head, and they were trying to like not let it go off, which basically was very symbolic for the things they were teaching about, like abstinence and sexual continence and stuff like that. And he was a postal inspector, the secretary of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, which after he passed away, it like went on to one of his buddies, but after that, it basically thankfully folded. It was just basically like neo-Puritan censorship. And so anyway, he was born in New Canaan, Connecticut on the 7th of March of 1844. He was the 4th of 10 kids, and he was like a religious fanatic, basically the Congregationalist spirit of American founding, like Puritanism, like Pilgrimism. Like basically he was like, oh, go to church every week. I mean, obviously nothing wrong with going to church every week and being religious, of course not, but he was just like basically taking it way too far, and like promoting his own, like pushing his own personal like strict morals onto everybody based on how he saw the world. Oh, why can't everybody be like me? And if you're not exactly like this like strict Puritan ideal of so-called Americanism, like you're just a horrible person. And he had some really creepy, like fetishistic, hardcore maternal worship. It's basically like rivaling like Beatrice Sparks, like, oh, dear sweet Mommykins. Mommykins is like the best woman ever, and like no one could be better than my dear sweet, darling, precious Mommykins. It's just like really, really creepy. And he lost his mother to birth complications at the age of 10, which is really ironic because he like sought to control women's reproductive rights. And also his wife, unfortunately, she lost their first, well, obviously they both lost their first child, but anyway, they like had difficulties conceiving after that, and like finally after many years his wife had a child, which suggests she might have been damaged by the birth. And like he still didn't realize, oh, not all women can be like that. They don't want to be, you know, pregnant every year and like constantly having children they can't support, or that their bodies are just giving out on them. And he also later unofficially like adopted a child. I believe it was like a vice-raid or something, and he saw a baby girl there, and they're, oh, let's adopt this girl too. We won't like, you know, file it with the authorities, or but obviously like adoption was done much differently in those days. And so anyway, he joined the Civil War at the age of 19. One of his older brothers had also been in the Civil War, and this was basically his love of censorship began in November of 1864 when he was a clerk in a provost marshal office, which was part of the military police, and he was really disliked by the other soldiers because like, oh, he's such a religious fanatic trying to control what they do. Oh no, you're playing cards, or you're rolling dice, or you're talking about sex and you're not married or whatever, or you're like doing it with a prostitute who isn't your wife, and just like basically like putting his nose where it doesn't belong. And he also like was writing in his diary about like, oh, I was tempted by Satan, or Satan is trying to get me to commit a sin. And like basically the Ms. Sohn is kind of reading between the lines and saying, oh, I think he was talking about like not masturbating or like giving into that temptation, and it was just basically like a sin, a so-called sin he was struggling with throughout his life. And so after the Civil War, he had difficulties, you know, bouncing around with like, where should I live, or what should I do for a job, or I'm not earning enough money. And so eventually he moved to New York City in 1867. When he got there, like the Bowery, like which became like Skid Row around that time, that was basically one of the parts of Manhattan. Basically, it was like basically all congregated downtown, and with like this huge like population all crowded together, like things he deemed sins, and like things which were, you know, legitimately like great social issues that needed to be addressed. They were all basically clustered all together in the same area. And so he met a New York City that was like fraught with crime, gambling, prostitution, poverty, saloons, porn, which obviously was much different from like current day pornography. I guess like even by, you know, modern standards, what was considered porn in those days would be pretty much, you know, like not really that big of a deal. It's like fairly like tame, like, oh, a book with like, you know, sexual etchings, like lithographs, like, so what's the big deal? It's not like, you know, actually like a film of doing it. And so also he encountered a lot of erotic literature and art, which again was like very tame by modern standards, obviously like shocking to many people in the 19th century, particularly if they had never encountered that before or knew it existed. Sex toys, lots of, you know, peep shows, boxing, and pool halls. I love playing pool myself, and obviously it has a much different connotation now than it did then. Many pool halls in the like 19th and early 20th centuries were considered like, you know, dens of sin because of other things besides playing pool that was going on there, and like, you know, bars and just all this stuff. He was absolutely shocked, and he, you know, just wanted to shut it down. And there were also many birth control devices being sold widely, like condoms and pessaries, which were kind of not exactly like, but a sort of analogous to like an IUD. It basically unplugged the womb so conception couldn't occur, and just basically like various different like 19th century versions of contraceptions like that. And also abortifacients, like a woman would drink this like concoction or take these pills. Like some of them really didn't work that way, but some did, or they weren't like really intended, but like, oh, I think I might be pregnant, so I'm just gonna like take these like I'm sorry, like I'm blanking on the word. I've seen it, you know, just the different kinds of like herbs and seeds and stuff they would mix into the pills, and like they would like have a miscarriage from that because just like obviously so many factors contributing to why they wouldn't want to be pregnant. And around this time in the late 19th century, there was a rise in abortions in New York City. They cost about $10 on average, and like surprisingly, most of the women seeking abortions, they were like, you know, American born, like WASPs, like middle class, and they wanted to avoid like kids within the first few years of marriage. These weren't, you know, like poor women. Well, obviously poor women were seeking it too, but most of the women, like majority getting this procedure or taking the pills or the powders or whatever, they were like just like the so-called like white and delightsome women. He was like totally like fetishistic about protecting. So anyway, he also joined the YMCA, which fueled the anti-vice crusades. It was basically kind of like a match made in heaven or hell, depending on your views of the situation because they were like super super duper like like religious Christians in those eras, and they were also like giving like, room and board for men to stay and like things to eat. It wasn't just like a gym to go work out. And so basically after this point it was like a free for all on anything that was not G-rated, even like anatomy textbooks for like scientific like lectures in universities, or doctors sending information about contraception to married couples, or just like basically anything that wasn't all like, oh, pure sweet little Disney and mommykins and daddykins, just like ugh. Now the first women who Mr. Comstock persecuted, which are covered in the book, are the sisters Victoria Woodhull and Tennessee Claflin. They were spiritualists and suffragists and basically free lovers, and they were like, a lot of these women were publishing their own, or publishing or just writing in other people's like magazines and newspapers, which were in the either in the indie press or like just a more like widespread readership among like people in the know, or like in members of like the radical community. And they were like convicted of mailing obscene papers, and for a time they were living in England, which obviously was much more free than America. They didn't have this like legacy of Puritanism. Obviously there were different like social problems and like repressions over there as well, but it was like much different than America, because they just didn't have that like tradition of this is we were founded by Puritans, and this is all about like don't do anything fun or like repress everything like that. Like and even today, like Europe is so much more like liberal and like radical than the U.S., but obviously that's getting off into the weeds of another subject. And then it's about the husband and wife, Angela and Ezra Haywood. They were convicted of sending so-called obscene books through the mail, and they were doing like frank sex lectures and talking about birth control through abstinence. And something is really weird, I'm shocked some people like still believe in this, so-called like mental birth control. So basically like you will yourself not to conceive a child when you're being intimate. Like it really doesn't work that way. Or saying like, oh, healthy babies are only born from couples who are in love and they are consenting to the sex act, and they want to have a baby. So basically like you can have sex, but if you practice the so-called mental birth control, you can easily put like 4 or 5 years between each child, or you just don't have sex during that time, because unfortunately birth control just wasn't easy to get. And a lot of these women did believe this very similar concepts, like, oh, a man can just like will himself to not reach his climax, and so basically he won't risk getting the woman pregnant, or just like, oh, if the baby will be healthy and morally upright and have a wonderful life, all because the parents wanted to have a child and they were like in the right frame of mind. Like that's really naive, but like for the era, I guess they did think it was kind of like progressivism. And they also believed in like equal relationships. So like basically they didn't like the idea then that marriage was a form of slavery. A woman like basically lost all of her legal rights when she married a man. She became passively identified as Mrs. Husband's full name. She couldn't own property or like do much of anything. They believed like in a more like egalitarian progressive ideal. And the above mentioned, they believed like anorgasmia was possible for a man. Oh, he just had to will himself not to ejaculate, and like there would be no worry of pregnancy. Like seriously, how naive can you get? But again, that was kind of like very like progressive thinking, or like it's kind of on the right track, but just like not really getting it. But it's like a good effort like in the context of that era. And then there was Madame Rastel, whom some people might be familiar with. Her real name was Anne Lohman. She was an abortionist for mostly poor and working class women who were denied so-called therapeutic exemptions. Like, for example, if the woman's life was in danger, well, obviously then you couldn't tell from sonograms if the baby was like severely deformed or anything, but like it would, I guess, mostly be because of like very serious like health conditions or just other things that deemed therapeutic. And unfortunately she committed suicide after he started persecuting her. And like this was just like a horrible thing. Like he was going after these women who don't want to control their own destiny, instead of like, oh, I'll just ban this, or like put this woman out of like power, or like she won't be able to offer her services anymore. That just like drives things underground. And you need to, if you really like want abortion to become like very as rare as possible, and only like basically sought for like life-saving reasons, like just strike at the roots of why women are like seeking it, or why they would want it, instead of, oh, I'll just ban it. And that's like putting a band-aid over like a big thing. And so anyway, the next woman who was persecuted was Sarah Blakesley Chase, who sold syringes with a post-coital spermicide, which is kind of like a Lysol douches were in the mid 20th century. Yes, believe it or not, many so-called doctors, at least in these like ads, I have a whole folder of them in my iPhoto library about like, oh, promoting douching with Lysol as like a wonderful way to do birth control. This is like a whole wild topic, and Dr. Chase said she wasn't like promoting abortion. She didn't believe in abortion or birth control necessarily, but these like, oh, you can just like douche with this after you have intercourse, and there's less risk of a pregnancy, or if it's already occurred, it just like won't happen. And so basically, again, this was like doesn't really seem like, you know, modern by like 21st century standards, but you know, they were like on the right track for the 19th century. And she also believed in voluntary motherhood, which would help to reduce some poverty and social ills, which like really does make sense. Like studies have shown, and you know, like in real life, that when women have fewer children, obviously like you can still have a big family if you have the money and the space and such, but like generally when women have fewer children, they're able to, you know, like enter the workforce again sooner, like make more money, like help to support themselves, like go to college and stuff like that. So again, this is like really, really progressive thinking, and that's really threatening what Mr. Comstock believed about like women and their so-called place in society. And Dr. Chase also believed in dress reform. That's a whole subject for another video too. Unfortunately, there were a lot of like radicals in the dress reform movement, and they like started propagating these like BS like myths about corsets like crushing organs and like displacing your ribs and all this other nonsense. But again, like the dress reform movement did have initially good intentions, despite like getting sucked into some like, you know, radical pseudoscience. And she also believed in temperance. Like a lot of people might be surprised to find out like temperance was actually a progressive social movement in helping women, like very pro-feminist. Obviously like prohibition like was horrible, and like it opened like a whole big can of worms. But back then, like, you know, all these men were going to like bars and saloons and like coming home drunk and beating their wives and children, and like, you know, not working or like wasting the family's money. So like they felt like, oh, temperance would be wonderful, get my husband off of drink and he'll become a more productive member of society and will be a much better husband and father. And the next woman he prosecuted was Ida C. Craddock. She was a very, very, very colorful character. Like for one thing, like she believed she had a ghost husband. I believe he was like 300 years older. Something she said, oh, he appeared to me one night and we had wild sex almost every single night. And even though she was like supposedly a physical like virgin in real life, she was like, oh, that's what gives me the authority to write about this. And this was also a big thing, like she for her to go by Mrs. when she was like working in England at some point, and when she was in various different cities in the U.S., because like back then, like, oh, she's just a miss, what would she know? Or like, and particularly the title Mrs. can convey like a kind of a social respect. Even some people might not believe this now, because obviously we have the title Ms. as a so-called default for all women regardless of marital status. But like many women who were not married and they were like past a certain age, they would start going by Mrs. because they just wanted to be taken more seriously than someone who went by Miss. It was like, you know, just graduating from girl to woman regardless of your marital status. And so Miss or Mrs. Craddock, she would give like private lessons in healthy, safe, respectful sex. Basically it was like helps to happy wedlock, and she would always refuse like minors who were trying to get her lessons. Like even when Mr. Comstock himself was sending some like, you know, dummy letters like, oh, I'm a 17-year-old or 16-year-old girl and I would like to come get your lessons or be mailed some of your like sex instruction pamphlets. She always turned them down because she didn't want to, you know, corrupt minors, or at least not like maybe a 17-year-old with parental permission. So this was one thing Mr. Comstock did a lot. He would send dummy letters or like go to people's or women's offices like pretending, oh, I want to get this book, or like I'm interested in your like syringe with the birth control, and it, like he would like bust them this way. This was like horrible, and he used all these like horrible like, you know, like weird like obviously fake aliases, but unfortunately a lot of people did like fall for this. And Mrs. Craddock had a real like nutcase mother. She was basically like living with her for a long time and like forced to live in like a little room in the house, and her mother was constantly, and she succeeded at least once in getting her confined to a loony bin because she just felt like, oh, my daughter is writing this note, oh, I'm going to threaten to burn all your like sex books and writings if you don't do this, basically like keep on the straight and narrow. And she was like a very, very intelligent, capable woman, but unfortunately she was Mrs. Craddock, not the nutcase mother. She was denied admission to the University of Pennsylvania. There were at the time, I feel like, women's only colleges, but still not as many as there were in the early 20th century. So unfortunately she was not, you know, able to go to school to get her like bachelor's and master's degree like some women in that era were. Just, you know, women's education has come so far. Mrs. Craddock wrote widely about, you know, sex, and she felt like, oh, it was not like pornographic at all. It was just like, oh, giving you frank information using like proper terms for like body parts and body functions, because she didn't want people to be like, you know, ignorant or just like not in the dark like Mr. Comstock. Oh, you're not supposed to know a sex exists until you get married, and then you're just supposed to like in the dark like missionary position lay back and think of England, don't enjoy it, just do it for procreation as much as absolutely humanly necessary. And she, unfortunately, she had like a very like male centric view of women's pleasure. Like, not to get too graphic, but there's one point in the book when she was talking about, oh my, I realized my husband was like, paying too much attention to like the uniquely female like appendage that was created solely for pleasure. And she was like really like felt like angry and ashamed of him because he's not doing like only like intercourse. And like, unfortunately, well, we do know now that like most women do not receive like full sexual like satisfaction the same way men do. Of what men consider like side dishes are often a woman's main course. And unfortunately, she bought into that view that like a woman should only be fulfilled completely by like just like the intercourse act, instead of like the little like side dishes leading up to it, or in addition, or like instead of it. So unfortunately, that just some women, as modern as and progressive as they were in other ways, they just like were still like very much products of the 19th century in other ways. And then the last two women who are talked about in the book, their lives and their cases with Mr. Comstock kind of intertwined because they did know one another in real life. Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger. Now, a lot of people might be familiar with Emma Goldman. She was an anarchist, like into the birth control movement. She was very much into labor rights and civil liberties. So basically, it was like a working class feminism. And unfortunately, at the time, many women who were into like suffragism and stuff like that, they were like bourgeois and rich. So they didn't really concern themselves with like the have-nots. Like, oh, what do I care about labor rights when I'm not the one working in the factory? Like, I'm not really concerned with birth control because I've already had all my kids, or I know what to do privately, or I could see like a fancy doctor abroad, or and like just like a private clinic if I have to do what I must to like prevent pregnancy or something like that. And so this was basically like a working class, like class-based material analysis feminism, instead of the like so-called like the bourgeois feminism that doesn't really speak for like the majority of women. And then obviously Margaret Sanger, does she really need an introduction? Most people are familiar with her as like one of the pioneers of the birth control movement. Anyway, obviously Margaret Sanger was like big in the birth control movement. She was like being persecuted by Mr. Comstock, and for a while she was like living abroad in England and Europe so she wouldn't get sent to jail. And she was like opening what became Planned Parenthood in New York City. And all these women were like lining up, and these women just didn't want to have any more children, or they just wanted to get birth control so they could like help the children they had and not be in poverty, and just basically things like that. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people have these like false ideas about Margaret Sanger, like saying, oh, she was a racist and a eugenicist, but they don't really point to any proof. And this is a bit in the epilogue, which basically gives a recap of the lives of the women who survived past their case. As before mentioned, like unfortunately, Mrs. Craddock and Madame Restel, they committed suicide because they were being persecuted by him, and they didn't want to risk going to jail because that would just be absolutely horrible for them in the workhouse and exploited. And when some of these other people went, like Ezra Haywood, I didn't mention, he went to jail, and this was horrible on his wife and children, because in that era women couldn't really work, so they were basically like starving and living off of relatives. So basically it was just a big like hardship for them. And so anyway, this is about Margaret Sanger, basically telling the truth about her. In recent years, her legacy has been reevaluated with regard to her views on disability, race, and heredity. There is no doubt that she had eugenicist supporters, and she recorded her patients' nationality, heredity, religion, occupation, and union affiliation. But in the 1920s, eugenics was considered scientifically sound, even by some African American leaders. Moreover, Sanger opposed the primary goal of American eugenics, to increase childbearing among the middle and upper classes. And a lot of people in those days, even including, shamefully enough, one of my heroes, President Theodore Roosevelt, thought it was like race suicide when white women just weren't having as many children as they so-called ought to. In the 1920s and 1930s, she endorsed the sterilization of institutionalized people to prevent those with developmental disabilities from passing on their genes, an appalling position that nonetheless had mainstream support. She praised Germany's sterilization program in 1934, which she called sterilization of the unfit, but added that if unfit refers to races or religions, then that is another matter which I frankly deplore. Her work on African American women's reproductive health was supported by W.E.B. Du Bois and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and there is no evidence that she wanted to coerce black women into using birth control or to reduce the African American population. Like, so seriously, a lot of people just like believe this nonsense better. Oh, I heard it somewhere, but there's no proof, and I'm just going to keep passing it along, and oh, I won't challenge this at all. And so obviously it's a very complicated topic. Eugenics, as above mentioned, the passage, it had mainstream support among many people, and they really didn't think this was a bad thing. I mean, obviously some people took it way too far, but for some people it was just about, oh, I just want to reduce the population, and it's a kindness for like mentally disabled people obviously called, not called that by that term in that era, like more like morons or feeble-minded or whatever. Oh, they shouldn't have children, or prisoners shouldn't have children because this will like increase the number of healthy children in society, and we don't want to like, put drain on society or increase poverty. So in their minds, like eugenics was actually a progressive thing. And so anyway, as I mentioned, like there's like the recap of the women in the back of the book, like showing, the things they did in the remainder of their lives after Mr. Comstock. Some of them lived like a long time after he passed away. And so the tide turned as birth control became more widespread in the U.S. in the view of so-called obscenity weakened. So basically he was like losing his grip. He was never particularly popular anyway, but people were like saying, oh, I want to reduce the number of children I have. I don't believe we should be having, like 12 kids, or like people should like begin having children the moment they get married. Or this really isn't obscene. This is just like a well-written erotic novel, or just basically things like that. And so the cultural norms were shifted. And I'm also going to read this from the chapter 13 on breach in the enemy's lines. And it's basically kind of like tying in his like reign of Puritan, neo-Puritan terror into like things still being faced by women these days. So basically it all comes full circle. The sex radicals' faith in the possibility of control, of marriage and of sex, aligned them with Comstock, their enemy. He wanted to assert control over sex to strengthen the family, while they wanted women to wield their own control over sex for the purpose of strengthening love. He wanted marriage to preserve traditional ideals. They wanted marriage to boost intimacy and, hence, equality. Each recognized the importance of private institutions to the public discourse. The sex radicals' work for reproductive rights led to important gains in civil liberties in the 20th century. One cannot look at the history of the ACLU without looking at its predecessor, the FSL, first formed to welcome Craddock out of the women's workhouse. To oppose the Comstock laws was to oppose all restriction on speech. The federal Comstock law itself is remarkable for its linkage of obscenity and contraception. An abortifacient powder was as filthy and debased as a stereoscopic view of dirty pictures on a postcard. Comstock's genius was in his understanding of the power of communication, the mail. By controlling access to information, he could limit women's options. A woman who could not easily find out where to get an abortion would likely still get one, but his hope was that some would be forced to reconsider, and surely hundreds of thousands did. The sex radicals' legacy lies in their use of speech to fight their repression of speech. Craddock, for example, used religious speech, which was supposed to be constitutionally protected, to educate about sex. In an era when sound information was increasingly difficult to find, they kept women informed about vital matters. Many of their methods are used by today's young radicals. As the free love historian Hal Sears pointed out, the sex radicals' playbook included using the power of their pens to fight an oppressive society, courting publicity to control the narrative, and maximizing the power of the legal system to alter public opinion. Even without the vote, they made their voices heard. The Comstock era revealed the power of radical organizing, direct action, lobbying, and publishing to change public opinion. The sex radicals had allies along the way. Progressive men such as Stephen Pearl Andrews, the Doctors Foote, Ezra Heywood, D. M. Bennett, Moses Harmon, William Stead, Ben Reitman, Sasha Berkman, Bill Sanger, and Leonard Abbott, who elevated them and recognized that women were better advocates for birth control than men, even though some of these men were ambivalent in their support. Women also benefited from the power and reach of the radical press. Today's radical publications, even online, are stymied by lack of funding and have circulations much smaller than those of Lucifer, The Truth Seeker, and Mother Earth, to name just a few. Gone are the days when provocative, left-leaning journals had hundreds of thousands of engaged subscribers all around the country, engaged in civil debate in their letters section. As one of the most powerful and single-minded men of his time, Comstock dealt a near-century-long blow to women's health. In his unflagging commitment to restrictive ideas of womanhood, family, religion, and national identity, he was a symbol of the nation's Puritan founding. Yet his attitudes cannot be understood separately from the era in which he lived. He was antebellum and postbellum America. From his hallowed view of his Congregationalist mother, his rural childhood, his brother's death in the Civil War, his arrival as a single man in vice-ridden Gilded Age New York, he saw himself as the guardian of women. The death of his mother, Polly, only strengthened his belief in the power of God and in the religious imperative to be fruitful and multiply. The center of life was the family, and the locus of the family was the mother. He believed that he revered women, but he felt that he should dictate how they should conduct their lives, and that he was the protector of women's natural innocence. When cultural norms began to shift, when single men and women were interacting in large cities, when prostitution led to disease and death, when industrialization changed the nature of work, he dug in the heels of his size 13 boots to face all perceived threats. Comstockism's mutability gave it a staying power. It cycled from obscene speech to contraception to gambling to immigration to political speech to immigration, again, to patriotism. As the face of America's enemies changed, Comstockism moved its targets. As I mentioned earlier in the video, like, Comstock he made the mistake. Obviously, he was like totally wrong, but if he had genuinely like cared about, oh, I want to reduce like, gambling or prostitution or abortion or whatever, like strike at the roots of what's like, leading to people to these decisions and choices, because like otherwise it just keeps happening. Only it will, happen underground. Like, for example, if you want to reduce crime, you should like start by helping to reduce poverty and like doing like social programs or like after school programs for at-risk children, like, poor rundown neighborhoods. Don't just say, oh, we're just going to like jail everybody the minute they do a little offense. Or like if you want to help to reduce abortion, you should like, give women like more access to birth control, or like greater like support for single moms or like poor couples, or just like that stuff. Oh, you just ban it all and that'll like totally work out. People just, or women won't just, get it. So he basically, if he genuinely did like care about this stuff, he just went about it in all the wrong way, just like a horrible like neo-Puritan censor. There were a few little nitpicks I had about this book. I got one point, she uses the modern like 21st century term sex worker, or like a sex work, to refer to prostitution. Obviously, as a second wave radical feminism, I'm fat feminist. I'm totally against like prostitution. It's like basically trafficking and exploiting women. Like very, very few women are doing it like voluntarily in these so-called like high class brothels. So like that's like a total anachronism to refer to like 19th century prostitutes. It's like sex workers. Like I hate that term so much. And at one point, Ms. Sohn also, I believe several points maybe in that section, she's referring to the northern part of the Lower East Side in Manhattan as a so-called East Village. That was not a name for that area until about 1966. It was all the Lower East Side. Until then, they basically remade themselves or wanted to look like an Eastern version of Greenwich Village. And like to this day, many older residents of the Lower East Side do not recognize the so-called East Village. It's all basically just like the Lower East Side. It's just like the northern, more gentrified part of it. Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing and liking the video. I really, really do appreciate seeing comments from my viewers, particularly about books I have enjoyed, so we can, have a conversation back and forth with it. If you like disagreed with any of my views, let me know in a respectful way, and maybe we can have a dialogue about it. Or if you've read this book, let me know. Or if you're looking forward to reading it. And also, don't forget to hit the notification bell so you can know when I upload my new content. And my next video, I'm planning for the 31st of January. This is the 30th anniversary of when I began writing one of my books, like all those years ago, on a really, really old computer. And I'm really, really looking forward to talking about that book with you guys. So thank you again for watching. I'll see you soon. Thanks. Bye.